I'm going to call the meeting of Monday, May 19th, 2025 to order. Um, would anybody either in person or Zoom want like to be the clerk for today?
I'm happy to.
Thank you, John.
Take attendance.
Yeah, we're gonna do a roll call.
Yep, sorry. Let's see. I'm going to follow my screen. Mark,
Here.
Scott,
Here.
Elizabeth,
Here.
John,
Here.
um,
Linda Miller's
Linda.
here.
Yeah, sorry, Linda.
Okay.
Peter's
I'm looking
here.
to be and Peter looking at my screen, and then Dan is here. Okay. Um, and John's kind enough to offer to be the clerk. So we have a few meetings minutes to approve. The first one that I see is October 7th, that was authored by or reviewed by Elizabeth. Do I have a motion or any comments?
Motion to approve, Peter.
Second.
Okay. Um, we'll go around the hub again. Peter,
Aye.
Linda, I know you're there.
Aye.
Thank you. Scott,
Aye.
Elizabeth,
Aye.
John,
Aye.
Mark, I know you're there too.
Aye.
Um, and Dan, aye. Did I forget anybody? I don't think so. Okay. Sorry. No, I think she said I didn't you? Maybe not. Well, Elizabeth, how do you feel about the minutes?
I did say aye, but I'll say
Okay.
aye again.
All right, thank you. Um,
Aaron just joined us.
all right, Aaron, do you feel like approving the minutes or you want to wait for the next vote?
Oh, no, that's fine. I approve.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Then the next set of minutes we have is the May 1st, 2025.
Motion to
This would,
approve.
okay. And a second?
Second.
Okay.
Can I suggest we approve the next two in one vote?
Yes, that's a great idea, John. And so we also have the minutes of May 5th, 2025. Scott was the clerk for those.
Yeah.
Do we have a motion? Oh, John, you just did, right?
I move to approve the remaining two sets of minutes. Yes.
Awesome. Peter,
Aye.
Linda,
Yes.
Aaron,
Yes.
Dan, yes, Scott,
Yes.
Elizabeth,
Yes.
John,
Yes.
yes, and then Mark, you already approved it? Okay, all right, great. Thank you, everybody. The next item of business is a discussion of the potential fiscal year 2026 community preservation funds for historic preservation at MCI Concord. I believe, Linda, you suggested we have a conversation about this. Are you prepared to sort of cue this up for us for our consideration?
No, but I'm happy to try. I think if we refer back to the Historical Commission response to our outreach, they sent a very well-constructed letter talking about the value of looking at the historical context of the site. And I also think that there seems to be consensus forming around preservation interests in the two properties on the site, the Warden's property and the White House. And I was observing some of the recent discussions with the CPC over some submissions, and it seemed to me if we had some intent to support those with CPC funds, given that they have a component category for historical preservation, that this would really be an optimal use of those funds, and also it would be a timely time to engage staff in putting forward an application. We wouldn't want to miss their deadlines. So I just brought that up and thought it might be a useful dialogue to begin, or to give some direction to.
Yep, thank you. That's helpful. Are there questions of the members of the board?
How specific do we have to be, Linda, in an application at this point? About,
I think it's a good question to find out.
yeah,
I know they have an application form, but yeah, I'm not an expert in CPC. I'm sorry, you said, who's
I think Ian Clifford is on the.
Oh, great.
I was also gonna ask a question.
Yep.
Trustee?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Sorry. My understanding with CPC funds is it's like, there's like a regular application cycle. Like it's not just one time. So I didn't know, particularly since the town doesn't own those buildings yet. Or potentially ever, would we wanna wait longer to figure out what we're really doing with them and who the owner is and what we would need CPC funding to do with them?
so I do have some experience with CPC applications, and have, I think, come to the CPC 3 different times for funding. And my experience is that they can be fairly flexible about what they fund, provided it fits into one of the categories, and historical preservation is one of the categories. I would imagine we could potentially apply for planning funds, just as we could apply for funds to, construct, rehabilitate, whatever. The way the cycle works is that you apply by a certain deadline in the fall. I think it's like September 1st or October 1st. It then works its way through the process to get onto the town warrant as part of typically a single article that has all the approved or recommended CPC funding projects, which is then approved at town meeting. So if we were to get started with an application now, it would be due in the fall for funding at town meeting 2026. The way the funding works is it's typically, once it's been allocated, the funds are paid as reimbursements, not as advances. So we would then have to have spent the money, present a submission to Ann at the CPC, to then be reimbursed for any expenses that we made that qualified under the grant they made to us. So the timing on this, it's a pretty long runway. I think that an application that says very specifically what we're going to do is typically more compelling. That said, if we had some well-defined planning activities in mind, we could, I would guess they would be open to that. The properties or the projects they fund don't need to be town projects. So I was involved with an application for the Wright Tavern. I've been involved with an application for the library, also for a recreation project at the high school. So they don't need to be town owned or controlled, but they do need to be of benefit to the citizens of town. So we have a lot of time to make a submission, and there's really no benefit to rushing a submission. So if we were to think this is something worth pursuing, this might be a source of funding for a component of our work in fiscal year 26.
Thank you, John. That was really helpful, actually, for me too. Are there I have some more questions, but are there other questions?
Yeah, just listening to this, so what I'm hearing is that we should later this fall get together with the historic commission who wrote that wonderful letter, talk with them about what they might need for preservation planning, and perhaps also start to put aside an annual component of the historic preservation CPC funds to create an incentive for the developer to redevelop the warden's house along the lines that we recommend. whatever comes out of our, think tank, process and visioning process. So we basically, it's gonna cost a lot of money at some point in the future, but if we squirrel away some of the CPC funds over time, it's gonna create an incentive for them,
Mhm.
whoever they may be.
So Dan, if I can jump in quickly, just
Sure.
a few clarifications. So there, John is correct. There is only one funding cycle for CPA funds in Concord. And it is not a rolling process because, as he said, everything gets reviewed and recommended by the Community Preservation Committee and put on as a warrant article for town meeting. So the earliest you would be on for recommendation to town meeting would be annual town meeting 2026. The funds would not become available till July 1st of 2026. The if it is a town project, those funds get allocated. It's not reimbursable. It's a town project. The funds get allocated and the project moves forward. Reimbursable is if it is not a town entity, if it's a nonprofit or another organization. What I would recommend to Peter's comment, if there is an idea of a project now, I would probably make the recommendation that one member of the committee who has an interest in this can just meet with Ann Clifford, who assisted the Historical Commission on drafting that memo. Talk about the ideas for different projects that would be eligible for CPA funding, and start that conversation now so that you are not at the 11th hour putting together an application that ultimately may not even be eligible under CPA funding. To Peter's other suggestion about squirreling away money to provide an incentive, for a developer to do historic preservation. Again, that every year the town can elect to allocate a certain percentage of CPA funds to those 4 different buckets of eligible funding. So that is something that could be done. And then, it's the mechanisms on, how those funds get utilized. Whether CPA funds can be actually given to a developer as an incentive, I'm not sure that that's an eligible project unless there are certain requirements met under CPA. If it is, for an incentive for a developer to put a historic preservation restriction on, on the superintendent's building or something, those that may be eligible, but I just want to make sure that start now with what it is you think may be an application, and work with Anne to start that research now on whether it is actually eligible or not.
Okay, great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Mark?
Yeah, I think the other 3 categories are affordable housing, open space, and recreation, all of which are in the mix for possible uses of the MCI property. So I think it's good for us to have our eye on CPA funds as a possible source, especially given, I think, based on the pre-read, what we're going to be hearing about the fact that in order to get larger community benefits, there may need to be some buy-in there. I'm not sure that we need to go a whole lot further in today's meeting, and I recognize we have a lot on the agenda. So
Yep.
I'm going to suggest that we acknowledge the schedule and maybe ask for volunteers to work the CPC. It is true that planning is one of the categories that can be used, and so if we think that there needs to be some additional planning into particularly FY27, we should take advantage of that.
happy to reach out to Ann Clifford.
Okay, that would be great, Peter. Is there anyone else that wants to participate in that? Linda or others?
I would be happy to, but I don't want to form a subcommittee, so.
Yeah, right. Yeah, thank you. And I would also, and maybe this is obvious, but I would encourage us to have a conversation with Designing Justice too. I mean, I suspect they may have some thoughts on it. Okay, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Mark. Thank you, Linda, for bringing it up. Thank you, Mark, for keeping us on schedule. The next order of business is item 4. It's updates from the town staff, Megan, and maybe a DCAM as well. But maybe Megan can do both, or she can. I can take a pass at it.
You know, in the interest of time, just a couple of quick updates here. One piece of news that I'd like to share is regarding earmark requests for FY26. And a few weeks ago, I heard from Senator Barrett's office, who had asked for some additional information about the town's request for MCI funding. And so he was looking for some of the details about what it would be spent on, what we're looking for. And I provided that over to his aide, and they did submit an earmark for $250,000. And I am a little bit unfamiliar with the state's website for tracking it. I see it in there. But where it is regarding, discussion and likelihood, it moves forward in the process. I can't speak to that. But there are two, notes that Senator Barrett put in. One is for $250,000 for MCI Concord. The other is for the, what we've been calling the PAC treatment for the earmarks from FY25. I don't believe that there is the PAC treatment or an earmark in the House budget at this time. So I just wanted to make you all aware of that. If the subcommittee thinks it's appropriate to reach out to the legislators to ask for support in the Senate's budget, that might be something that is timely. But that is some exciting news to further that effort.
Great.
I want to mention that the wastewater treatment discussions are ongoing. There was a meeting this morning with DCAM and staff and our attorneys to continue to discuss what that would look like and think about what types of, really kind of still early days of what types of things are going to be included in these conversations, what would make sense for timeline, and so that effort is ongoing. I think those are my two main things for today, Dan.
Okay.
Unless anything else.
No, thank you. Just scanning my notes quickly from our last DCAM meeting, the coordination meeting on the 9th. Mark highlighted the concern about losing momentum, so we discussed that. DCAM, Paul made it clear that they would really prefer to, it makes sense to issue the RFP once the zoning is completed and adopted by the town. Town of this was discussed briefly that the town is considering possibly breaking the funding request or spreading it over. Well, effectively having a special town meeting and separating the normal budget cycle from the other matters. So that may or may not influence the sort of timing for our ask and presentation. We talked a little bit about form-based versus standard Euclidean zoning approaches, really at a high level. Nothing's obviously being decided, just more pluses and minuses of that. Megan kept the control concern as a top priority for us, just sort of reiterating for DCAM and everyone's benefit that is a concern among several members of the advisory board. So that is not, that is still upfront. That's all I have. Um, Paul, if you have any other comments, if I've missed anything, you're welcome to. And if not, you can.
I don't think you missed anything. I would only reiterate that, we would love to help keep momentum through the summer. So if there is, if there are things that we should talk about, I think if there is, Megan's talking about the funding path, if there is a funding lull or an appropriate timing for the next DCAM formal public hearing, like any of those things, we're happy to, figure out how to keep momentum as we keep going through the summer and through the end of the fiscal year and into the next one.
No, thank you for highlighting that. And Paul actually was great. He's presented a couple different ideas for possibilities, so we can discuss that at a future meeting. I think that's about it on that item. So the next item is an update on defining the visioning scenarios. So I believe I'm going to hand that off to Rhiannon and or someone else among their agency team.
Great. Hello, everyone. Can you hear us okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, we're going to go ahead and share our screen. We're going to try to make this quick, but what we wanted to do was revisit the conversation we had on May 5th, as well as revisit the public workshops and subsequent surveys, and talk through some kind of additional scenario studies that that you all would like to see. And so I'm just going to pull up on my screen our quick slide deck. So this slide deck we sent around, I believe, Friday evening. And so I apologize for sending that over to you on a weekend, but wanted to give you all a chance to look at things and become somewhat familiar with what we wanted to dig into. And of course, we've made a few tweaks since we sent that over, and we can send the updated version of this deck after this conversation. All right, so let's just dig in. So we're going to go through what our goals for the meeting will be. We'll dig into engagement so far, and then we want to focus the majority of our time around scenarios, reframing, and discussion. So to start, we're gonna dig into a little bit of what your neighbors, what your friends, what your families have all shared are their desires for what the future of the site can be. We want to number 2 and number 3 are really important. We really want to focus on revisiting and consider broadening or rethinking about the scenarios that we shared on May 5th, and we'll share a little bit more about those in a moment. And the rationale for that is to not just focus on what is feasible from a developer's perspective, but also how do we think about what is most beneficial for the town, whether that be financial, social, cultural, against an appropriate program mix that help us to achieve those goals. And so I think having the public workshop, that first public workshop under our belts, having that conversation with you all on May 5th has helped us to better understand what we imagine those scenarios could be. And then last but certainly not least, we've started to assemble just high-level metrics that we'll be using to inform the final 3 scenarios that we select together. Hopefully, we land on those today, and then we'll develop the project a bit further using actual numbers to begin to understand what those metrics mean for different trade-offs with each scenario. So, as we've said since the beginning, this continues to be a sprint. We appreciate you all coming along on this very quick journey with us. I'm not going to go through the schedule in any significant depth, but just to reinforce that we continue to be committed to getting to a good place with these scenarios and having them ready to jump off into a deeper conversation about zoning post June 30th. There's a slide that I included in the pre-read that we sent to you all on Friday that we won't go through, but that because there's just so much text on that slide, but that slide essentially communicates this exact same schedule, but articulates what we imagine the key decisions that we want to make together are. and then any key deliverables that we're sharing with you all. So again, apologies for going so quickly through this. We want to make best use of our time together and focus on conversation, but Justina is going to walk us through what's been said so far.
Hi, so we have done a lot of methods of engagement so far, and this aligns with the engagement strategy that we set out with the advisory board and Designing Justice Design Space early on in the process. So far, we've, with the help of the Community Outreach Subcommittee, done outreach to 97 key town stakeholders. We've shared postcards around town, and we'll continue to share more postcards around town for this next wave of engagement. We've done 2 public workshops and are planning 2 more. And as of this morning, we had 1,994 website visits, and 953 of those were in the week leading up to those April workshops. So the website is continuing to be updated with workshop content and surveys, and we're gonna keep updating that as well as the making changes to the survey that the Community Outreach Subcommittee requested last week. So high-level takeaways from the community workshops. On April 30th, we had 118 sign-ins across the 2 workshop sessions, which are 3 to 5 p.m. and 6 to 9 p.m. Not everyone signed in, so we estimate that this is really about 150 attendees, maybe more, and they're mostly Concord residents. We so far have had 21 online survey respondents and are expecting more, given the PTG meeting tomorrow evening. But over 248 comments were received on those sticky notes that you see in all the photos. And lots of it was feedback about the Route 2 Rotary and Warner's Pond. There's a lot of curiosity and diverse opinions on types of housing and kinds of programming, which we got into a little bit deeper in that visioning station. There was mixed feedback on the preservation of certain aspects, such as the warden's house and the wall, which I'm sure will be fed into the conversation that Linda led earlier, as well as lots of interest in the creation of a museum and different types of programming. Overall, there's a lot of appreciation for opportunities to learn and engage in the project processes. People really were grateful that they had an ability to provide feedback. So some of that feedback on community and culture was 40% of responses prioritized more attainable housing, while 23% supported options for aging in place and a range of housing sizes to meet diverse needs. And I should also just say this is really high level across the 6 topic areas, so we're just hitting the key points here. But we will be sharing a more in-depth synthesis later on. So on the buildings and structures topic area, 30% of comments suggested showcasing the site's history through a museum, a public art, or some other interpretive signage. And there was some interest in affordable housing and a hotel. On the environment and open space front, when asked about future amenities, 33% of respondents wanted natural spaces, 18% wanted walking trails, and 17% a community center. So there's a lot of interest in making this, incorporating park elements into the site, as well as strong support for restoring pedestrian access to the Assabet River and linking it to the existing rail trail and surrounding rail networks. And so on the right, there's a couple of comments that have been called out there. On the transportation access front, again, 25% of the comments were about the Rotary and Route 2, with a lot of confusion about plan changes and how the timelines intersect between this process and with the Route 2 process. On the energy and infrastructure front, interest in efficient reuse of the wastewater treatment plant and sustainable building practices, and a lot of attention to mobility and a focus on natural resources. And then finally, on the economics and feasibility topic area, 42% of comments highlighted mixed use development and adding amenities that enhance the town. And there was overwhelmingly an agreement to keep big box stores out of Concord and to protect West Concord businesses and the character of the community. So this last item is the project characters, which we did with the advisory board in that early April advisory board meeting. And so they have been rebranded a little bit following conversations with the advisory board to these 5 characters. We have supportive, healthy and resilient, artsy and cultural, active and recreational, and innovating. And so much like the exercise that we did with you all, we asked the public to create pies. And so here's a overview of what those pies look like. So on the left is the advisory board pies, and on the right is the ones from the public workshop compiled together. And you'll see that the distribution of pies is very similar in terms of supportive and housing resilient. That active and artsy for the advisory board was broken out into active and recreational and active artsy and cultural for the public workshops, but a similar distribution there. So and that other category was filled in a lot more on the public workshop side with things like housing and commercial spaces, but not just housing and commercial spaces. So key takeaways here are people want to see a really diverse array of programming and for the site to support different needs of the town and of the West Concord community. So upcoming engagement milestones, the surveys, we have the first one live on the website. The second one's going to coincide with those May 28th workshops, which are coming up next week. And we're going to continue to update the website. You'll also see that there's an online workshop that we have added. So that's going to be to target people who weren't able to come in person. That will be the day following the in-person workshop on May 28th from 7 to 8 p.m. And that Zoom link is updated and current. So we would love if you could join us on that in case there are questions directed toward the advisory board specifically, but feel free to join in at your own leisure. The public workshops will be held at Juro Park with the rain location of the townhouse, and we're planning focused conversations for this interim time.
And we had a great conversation with the engagement outreach subcommittee on Friday and reflected on the experience of the public workshops and the survey. And so we're making a few tweaks there and also are thinking about how we can best funnel or filter people into the workshop to ensure that they're able to experience and deeply understand what the intent of the meeting is, since we're getting into much more tactical exercises around what this site can be. And so really excited to keep fine tuning that approach, and we'll have that ready for next Wednesday's meetings. So now we're going to dig into scenarios reframing. This is our favorite topic of the day. I hope you all are ready. Please stretch if not. We have a lot that we're going to go through. It is pretty dense content, and you'll be hearing from myself and Kate from the agency team, as well as from the Merge team and from Landwise and U3. And so we'll try our best not to step over each other while we're talking, but we're all just so excited to share some of this with you all. To start, as I said, and when we talked about the meeting objectives, we came out swinging with three big scenarios that were really focused on what is feasible from a market perspective. And I think a lot of the feedback that we got post that conversation was that this felt like a really nice opportunity to expand our reach and to look across the board at all the things that could happen, especially given some of the feedback we received from workshop participants, many of whom would like to see a variety of different uses happen to the space, but really don't have a sense for what the trade-offs might be when you think about those different potential new uses. And so we want to start just by going back to this original site plan that we had shared with you on May 5th, and that is that communication that there are about 54 acres of land once you've removed any spaces that will not be developed for a variety of reasons, whether those be state or local regulations or considerations around future use. That there are about 54 acres that can be developed, and then there are also a few buildings that we could reuse. And so those are the kind of flexible moments for us. We also want to ensure that we flag that the Junction Village deed has affordable housing that's required housing, and that is considered as part of this study as well. And then also that this is a moment for us to step back and not only think about what the market can feasibly support, but also what will best support town revenue, as well as what will best support or consider the impacts to community.
Rhiannon, quick question. The arrows on that on that map, that shows existing roadways and the
Those
direction.
are existing, yep, those are existing roadways, existing curb cuts, and then anything in dashed are places that, together with Vera Happold, we identified as potentially being future connections that could be made, but no decisions have been made.
Thanks.
Yep, good question. All right, so this diagram that you will see here on my screen is that kind of full spectrum that we had started with a few weeks ago, that we didn't share with you all, and we apologize for not doing that, but it really just like, what are all of the different things that this site could potentially support, not considering all of the trade-offs that come with each of these. And the first is to do nothing, that the site is not used, that it does not change. That could happen for this site, and that could happen for a variety of different reasons. But it's important to note or to acknowledge that by doing nothing, there are costs that would be incurred with the do nothing scenario. Then there are a different level, there are different levels of intensity of development that could happen here. And so we're gonna kind of walk you through lowest to highest. That lowest level of intensity of development is to consider the future of this space as blue, which I realize is not on our legend, and we'll make sure to add that before we, oh yeah, it is, okay. I just can't read. So the blue one is about community and civic uses. And so that's anything that you see in blue across each of these scenarios is if you were to take that 54 acres and to consider what percentage of that becomes each use, that first use would be community and civic use. The green would be open space, and that's open space and all of the ways that you could think about open space, whether that be a park or greenways, the like. And then the last little square is housing. So that's again, going back to that first slide, that Junction Village does need to be included in the redevelopment of the site, and so housing associated with the deed restriction on Junction Village. The second is to have kind of a 50-50 split of housing and lower density, so lower density housing as well as park space, and then a smaller community or civic use. The third is to have open space, which takes up about a third of the site, and then use the remainder of the site both for the Junction Village deed restricted housing as well as commercial. And for commercial, for the purposes of our discussion today, is very much focused on retail, office, hotel, light industrial. So that full range of commercial uses. So those first three lowest intensity of development, what we understand through our work together with Landwise is that any of those three will require public investment to be realized. And that public investment can come from a variety of sources, but it will require some costs to the town or to other entities.
Rhiannon,
so then,
what is, I'm sorry, what does plus JV mean?
JV is Junction Village.
Okay.
Yep, we can add that as well.
One quick question, Rhiannon.
Yep.
This is just for the 54 acres, so the amount of public open space, this is a question, that's in the riverfront setback is or isn't counted on the scenario maps.
We did not count it.
Counted, yeah.
So that would be that open space that would be along the river's edge would be in addition to this. Which is why you'll see at the very end one that takes full use of the site and doesn't consider any additional open space on top of the riverfront.
Thank you.
It's a great question. Any other questions before I talk about
Off
this?
the top of your head, how many acres that is? The riverfront area?
How many acres the riverfront
Yeah,
easement is? I think it's about 10 to 12.
Yeah.
yeah, okay, thank you.
Yep, of course. I believe we included the wetland in there as well,
That's excluding the wastewater treatment.
excluding the wastewater treatment facility. All right, so then what you will all be familiar with is that kind of shifting into a higher level of development intensity, and that is the three scenarios that we shared when we met on May 5th. And so that is looking at kind of a lower number of housing units together with more of kind of a mixture of uses, so commercial uses. And then also an allocation of additional open space that at what we're calling average market share, looking at open space commercial, but then also much higher density housing, and then that above market share. So very much focusing on what does it mean to take full advantage of the site for a mixture of uses, primarily focusing in on commercial and housing.
What does market share mean in this context? I just don't understand.
So when we're in this context, I think what we're saying is what levels of development would be easiest to go about developing. So below market share would be that there might be some level of subsidy that might be required. Average is that it likely could, the term we've used in the past, that it likely could pencil out, that there wouldn't be a need for subsidy. And then the above market share is that it has a very high likelihood that it could be developed without needing any support for funding.
Rianne, do those roughly coincide with what John presented in the first?
They
First
do.
go around.
They're exactly
Okay.
what John presented in the first presentation.
Thanks.
Yep. I believe
Market
it
share
was
is his term. Yeah.
I think it was in, of course, we're trying to kind of pull back a little bit, but in this first one, we had talked about 500 units. In the second one, we had talked about 750 units, which is where we focused our time during our workshopping. And the third one was 1,000.
Rianne, this is just a minor comment, but maybe given that I had the same reaction when I first saw this to the question, to Linda's question. It also, like, I think so maybe consider renaming those three that are noted as market share, not only because I think it's not intuitive, but it also is not consistent with how you've labeled the other scenarios, which are more descriptive as opposed to like economic.
Yeah, that's fair, Patrick.
We can definitely do that. Yeah, we can definitely add those. We can make that tweak.
Cool.
Yep. And then this last one, that high density on the far right, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, the far right is to consider what are some other ways that we could think about the mix of uses that are also market driven, that could also support town goals while also be feasible to a developer. It's just that this would take a lot longer to be realized because it's primarily focused on commercial uses alongside a smaller kind of sector of housing, and there are a lot of reasons for why it might take longer to be realized, some of which is just the kind of current state or condition of the economy and a lot of unknowns around the future of commercial uses.
Can I just add one kind of there's one thought here on the issue of timing. We talked this a little in the community outreach meeting last week, but we know that there'll be nothing done to the site before 2028, right? So it's going to take years to get to the beginning of any construction. But I think it's worth thinking about really how long a horizon we would expect the complete redevelopment to take. And I'll just throw out one example that I think a lot of us are familiar with and not dissatisfied with. West Concord, the planning department produced a visual master plan of West Concord in 2010. It identified a whole bunch of things that might happen in terms of new housing, rehabilitation of commercial space, et cetera. We're now 15 years into that process. It's kind of a loose process, but we're 15 years into it. And I still think there's probably rough numbers, 30% of what was imagined there has not happened yet. So it's going to be probably 20 to 25 years before West Concord, before that master plan is fully realized. And I kind of think that feels like a long time. And if you had told me back in 2010, it would be 25 years before it was done, I would have been wringing my hands and saying how horrible that is. But in fact, I think it's happened at a comfortable pace. And I think that we should be open to the idea that we don't need a redevelopment vision that's going to happen in 5 years. It may take longer because business cycles change, different things become possible, other things become harder to do. I just think as an advisory board, we should be cognizant of the possibility that the redevelopment horizon could in fact be a couple of decades, and that might be okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that a lot of the conversation we've had with Dan and Patrick is like doing what we know is right, versus trying to move things at a quicker pace or to make things work based on what we know now. And so I think, John, as you've put it, that really resonates with us as well, is that this development could likely take a really long time, and that's okay.
Yeah,
Just-
sorry, I was just going to say, I think it, and I don't want to take us too far afield right now, but I think it's going to depend a lot on probably the implementation scenario that gets chosen. I mean, if it's going to be more developer driven, it could be accelerated. But I don't think we need to sort that out. I do agree with John that I think it's really important to have some expectations around time horizons.
And to just sort of build on the expectations for time horizons, perhaps we could have Landwise sort of give us an idea of what the absorption rate is for some of the different uses in the marketplace so that people have a better understanding. Industrial, light industrial, developing a 20 lot subdivision of those types of uses, you're doing great if you sell one a year. So, you just have to set expectations for people. And I think if we can do that with Landwise assistance in that aspect, that would be good.
Yeah, and this is John from Landwise. Just to that point, the three scenarios that were shared on May 5th, that was part of the idea, was that it was essentially showing 10 years worth of demand. And it was a 15-year financial model, including, some years in the lead up to prep the site and that kind of thing. So that's part of the reason why you have these terms that are non-intuitive about the market share, because it's the same time period, but the absorption possibly happening slightly faster, right? So that's part of what's we've been doing in the background is, we think it's based on those numbers, a 10 to kind of 15-year time horizon.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Scott, do you have a question?
Yeah, I also want to follow up on John's comment about the time frame of build out. I was just curious, maybe from Paul's standpoint, what he's maybe thinking. Maybe it's too premature, but are we looking at a master developer, or are we looking at a master developer that will then carve it up and then sell it to different developers depending on the usage? Just that might be a way of expediting things versus having a master developer. When we work with master developers, it's a long horizon because it takes so much time to build it out, and they build it out. And I'm just curious what the model, maybe Paul and DCAM is thinking. Is it just one developer, or is a developer with maybe multiple, be able to go out and break it down into smaller developers, other developers, depending on the usage?
Scott, I think that's exactly the right type of thinking here, obviously, but it's too early to say. Like I wouldn't begin to tell the developers what to do at this point. I don't think that we would be opposed to either of those paths. Somebody who knows what they're doing and comes in and does the whole thing. I think it's just as likely that somebody would come in and break out different pieces, but it also depends on what ultimately they're trying to build under zoning. So if it's, Junction Village on the left there and not much else in terms of vertical development, that's a very different question than if somebody is coming in and trying to do a high density mixed use campus. So if it's mostly 1 and 2 family homes is a different story. To I think Peter's point there, it's also a different story than somebody carving out different blocks for vertical development.
Yeah.
So we will be looking to zoning guidance before we have a better sense on that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions before we shift into talking more deeply about the scenarios? All right, we're going to go through. So trying to map this a different way, we talked about it from the perspective of intensity of development. Now, if we were to graph that along, what we understand are the biggest impacts to the town. So the low revenue potential to the town being at the bottom, high revenue potential to the town being at the top. So you want to be closer to the top if you want the town to make more money back, versus along the bottom line, or the x-axis, that you talk about low feasibility to a developer, really difficult for a developer to engage in, versus high feasibility to a developer, what would be the easiest for them to engage in. And you can see that the do nothing scenario doesn't work for anyone, and so it's in our best interest to ensure that we are thinking about development that can do both things, and that as you get closer and closer, further away from things like open space or park space, and closer to a good mix of housing versus commercial, that's where you start to find a sweet spot of supporting both the town alongside the feasibility for a developer. And so to even further try to understand or share with you all what it means as it relates to each of the different development scenarios, we wanted to assemble a kind of preliminary list of what we're calling metrics. These metrics, and you'll see in a moment, you've probably already seen if you've looked at the slide deck, that none of the scenarios have $5 signs or 5 stars across the board. That each one of them has a something that works really well and something that might not work quite as well. But the purpose of this exercise is to help us start to use this to make informed decisions about which scenarios are best. So that first metric is about developer attractiveness. It's the ability for the site to be developed aligned with today's market conditions. So as John said, what over the next 10 years of demand, what can happen here? And so small dollar sign, $1 sign versus $5 signs, anything that has $1 sign, it's less valuable. And so for this instance, $1 sign isn't feasible for a developer. It in some ways is almost a negative. And then $5 signs is high feasibility for a developer. The second metric is about shouldering upfront costs. So this is the ability for the town to see the site improved without incurring any debt or expenses to taxpayers. And so $1 sign means that there will be substantial public funding required, and so that means additional debt and expense to taxpayers. $5 signs means that taxpayers are not paying for a thing that is largely privately funded. The third metric is fiscal impact to the town. And so that is, thinking critically about town finances. This is where we take into account some of the kind of more indirect costs, like the impacts to schools, like the impacts to your infrastructure. And so in this instance, what we're doing is we're taking the tax revenues minus the costs to the town, and that is ultimately what we're looking at is what is the net revenue of this site to the town. And so that first dollar, the idea of $1 sign means it's a net negative impact. $5 signs is significant positive impact. 2 more metrics. This fourth metric, community facilities. So it is what is the site going to create as it relates to physical spaces, whether it be open spaces, trails, new facilities, or reused facilities that directly impact or support town residents. And so this also would be in alignment with any recent town plans, especially with your open space and recreation plan. So 1 star, no investment in community facilities, and 5 stars is many public facilities. And then the last one, I think to all of our conversations earlier, and this is something that I believe Land-wise edited a little bit, and we likely could continue to edit, is implementation timeline. So which of these is going to be quite quick in terms of implementation? And when we say quick, we mean 10 years. I think to your points in this discussion, we could make short term a little bit longer than 10 years. And then what are the things that could take much longer given precedent, given market feasibility? And so long term, we're looking at 20 or more years.
So Rianne, in these scenarios, are the externalities included? That is, we can build maybe so many homes or so many units of housing But at a certain point, we're gonna run out of wastewater treatment, even with the refurbishment of the existing wastewater plant that's on site. And then at some point, we're gonna need a new school. Are those externalities to the community included in how you've come up with this revenue feasibility approach?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Linda. The thought there was, and these are all order of magnitude costs for now. We imagine that we will dig more deeply into the actual cost for each of these metrics with the three scenarios that we identify. But we imagine that that's largely captured in the fiscal impact metric.
Yeah, and I can answer on that. So
Thanks, John.
and Amy, feel free to chime in if you want, but on the fiscal impact, so we have the models set up. Right now, it's looking at it more from an operating perspective in terms of enrollment and capacity to take on new students, and like when you would kind of hit the threshold of needing to build a new school. We don't have the data from the town yet. Like we've been trying to set up meetings with various folks, and given the recent tragedy that happened, unfortunately, that's been a little slower, but we will get there. So the capacity question hasn't really been factored in yet, but it will.
Thank you.
So this starts to give you a sense for each of those scenarios. Again, more dollar signs in this case is better. But as you can see, there are definitely within each of the scenarios, there are moments where you'll see more dollar signs in certain places and less dollar signs in other places. And so developer attractiveness, as I think this goes without saying, typically as the kind of intensity of development goes up, so too does the attractiveness to a developer. I think that is especially true when we think about what market demand is today, which we know is housing. And then of course, as you get into a space where you are considering developing uses that are it's a little bit more kind of fungible, what might be feasible from a market perspective. That's when attractiveness begins to go down. So this last one, the number of dollar signs goes down. Then when we shift into whether or not the town needs to shoulder upfront costs, again, you're seeing that park spaces, places that don't generate revenue, are also going to be less attractive from the town's perspective versus spaces that are largely public funded or private funded and are and produce their own revenue, are going to have a positive effect on town's costs, with the greatest being that mixed use campus. Then town annual fiscal impact. So we've added a negative here just to reinforce that the fiscal impact of this more of a low density or park focused use will have a net negative impact on the town. All of the other scenarios where you are seeing more development, more ways to offset that impact, having a positive effect. But then on the flip side, when we think about community facilities, it's starting to shift. And so you can almost imagine these stars are their own form of dollar sign, that the direct impact to the community and support of the community is most supported when you think about more community facilities and more open spaces. And as you get further away from having open space and community facilities, the positive impact to residents goes down. I think Justina communicated this a little bit, but in the public workshops, there were a lot of people who really were excited about this site becoming a park, becoming a natural space. And so I think it's important that we talk about that together with the community, together with you all, reinforce that it does have community support, but at the same time, there are trade-offs. And then also, last but certainly not least, thinking about implementation. This one varies greatly as we think about the different timelines that we might need to consider. What we do know is that when we consider the future use as a park, or when we're considering a greater share of the site being used for more commercial, needs, that's when you're gonna have those longer timeframes. And then the shortest timeframes are gonna be the spaces where you have far more housing, and the ratio of open space or commercial uses goes down.
Just one, go back for a second, just one quick comment along the lines of what Patrick was doing earlier in terms of tuning some of the language. I think shouldering upfront costs is a little bit unclear because not sure who shoulders it. So maybe you could say developer funds initially or developer funding or something.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you, John. I think you noticed too in the way that I was communicating it that I was I was trying to reinforce who it was.
Yeah.
Patrick, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. Thinking about the criteria a little bit to Linda's question, I would consider, I don't feel strongly, but I would consider, do you break out a criteria that is something around town and community services or town services? Just reading this scorecard, I think like if you looked at it objectively, it would have to take you to the right-hand side of this page. And so therefore it kind of indicates to me that it might not be like our criteria might not therefore be in balance, or otherwise this is an obvious answer.
Yeah.
Which I don't think that it is. And so I think like the I would expect that like similar to community facilities, just put bluntly, like the strain that this would put on the school system and like the potential impact it might have on like what is otherwise a very highly regarded and rated school system might be considered. That's kind of one point. The second point, which I think will be easier, is to the point around timing. It might just be like more clear to say like if short, if that means like less than 10 years, medium is 10 to 20 years, and long term is 20 plus, or whatever the numbers are, so that it is leaves less room for interpretation. I think short, people might think like, oh, this will be up and running, in 2028.
Yep. So we'll just use the numbers that we articulated on the last slide instead of asking people to make that leap with us. And totally hear you on the fiscal impact piece. I don't know, John and Amy, if you want to weigh in on that one at all too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to summarize these complex issues on one sort of table like this, but a couple of things. I think one, I think the fiscal impact kind of tool itself will be richer than this, right? So we have a pretty detailed model, and right now we're working on developing kind of a user interface that sits on top of that. And I think the board can decide whether that's something that can be public or whether it's just used within the board. But essentially, that'll give you more detail on for any given like specific program. What does that mean from a revenue and a cost perspective, right? So you'll see, okay, here's what's happening with school costs and the number of school kids generated versus here are the revenues that are coming off of these different uses. And I think that tool is useful because it might hold some surprises for folks, I think, in terms of, how high the residential is valued relative to the commercial actually is one thing. And obviously the school cost is always like the biggest thing on the cost side. So bottom line is that tool will be available, and I think it'll give kind of a richer perspective around the school costs and school facilities discussion. Was there another part to that, to what I was going to say, Rhiannon?
I don't think so. I think that captured it well.
All right.
I have one more comment. I find a negative dollar sign confusing.
We went back and forth on this, John, if we're being honest. Yeah, we went back and forth on using a negative dollar sign. Yeah, we can stick to just positive dollar signs, but keep it, consistent. Yeah.
I had one question, Rhiannon. Has there, we've talked a lot about developers and the town as kind of being the two parties here. Has there been any study of a third party, like would a parcel be sold directly to a long-term private owner, like a corporation or a entity that, would potentially like sort of take it over and, build maybe that's the sort of third one. There, obviously that's less, or the final one on the list there is like, it's less attractive to a developer, but maybe attractive to a long-term owner.
I can maybe jump in just real quick on that, Rian. I don't know if Jan wants to weigh in, but I think the two that are sort of the campus scenarios,
Yeah.
so 4 and 8 on here, the thought is that there could be a third party, whether it's an institution or a nonprofit, whoever it might be, that has a role in that. And I think that's part of what makes it more interesting, but also, kind of more complex and probably likely slower. But yes, so we are considering that. I mean, we don't know who that is or when they might emerge, but certainly that is something to consider, right? That it's not just the town, state, and private developer. There could be some other third party folks that have at least a control of portions of the land. I don't know if
Yeah,
Jan
I'll
wants to
just
weigh in.
add, that's a good summary, John, but I would just add that having that kind of thing very well articulated in this vision that we provide, that we're working on right now, in my experience, has a strong likelihood of bringing people out of the bushes and kind of bringing people to the table or organizations to the table that see what's going on and are interested in participating.
Any other questions before we shift into starting to articulate what we imagine the three scenarios are that are rising to the top? Or does anyone want to guess? Did anyone not do the pre-read and wants to guess what the three scenarios were that rise to the top? Everyone did their homework. All right, so the three that we've leaned into, and then I'll let Kate take it over from here, is that first scenario, beyond do nothing. This in part leans into what we heard a lot from the public workshop and the desire to create a very supportive and civically minded campus in a way. And so we're calling this a civic and institutional campus, but it's mission leaning. And then we've just reiterated that same understanding of all of those metrics that we used before. Of course, curious if you all have preferences on how we communicate the metrics, but just trying to play around with a different way of communicating it. So that's that first one. The second one, creating a vibrant center for commerce. So this is where we're thinking about focusing on revenue, especially thinking about long-term net positive impact to the town. And so that's where we have that deeper focus on more of a commercial campus. And then the last one that we thought we would deeper dive into is leaning into that kind of focus on what we know the market is supporting now. And so that's leaning more deeply into housing as the primary function of the site, alongside some mixture of uses, whether that be a hotel or other commercial uses, and then a smaller amount of open space. John, do you have a question or comment?
Yes. So on the first one, mission leaning, would that be a civic and municipal campus? When you say institutional, what does that mean? Does that mean municipal?
It means both potentially, John. So by civic, we mean civic and municipal, and then institutional would be that kind of partner that Rhiannon just referenced and Jan spoke about that, is yet undefined, but could be an institutional anchor, like a school, a nonprofit. Some additional,
I think in each of these, an anchor is key to the success of each one. It's just a matter of what the anchor is.
And then one more question in that first one, shouldering upfront costs, wouldn't that be low as opposed to high?
It means that the town needs to shoulder the upfront costs.
But the town or a partner.
More of that burden is on the town.
Yeah, it depends how if it's the civic use, as you're saying, it could be high, right? I guess that's how we have it framed here.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I thought in the definition that low meant, low is how much the developer shoulders. Got it. Okay. My bad.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, but it's helpful to understand when things aren't clear, because we want to make sure that, especially as we're kind of going through this with you all, that we use the most clear language, and that especially when we go to the public, that we're using that same language.
Yeah, I think this is a tough one.
Clarify right along John's line. So the shouldering upfront costs, should it say town shouldering upfront costs?
Yes.
Medium low?
Yeah, I think that's I mean, it's going to come down to a negotiation, but I think that's the good place to land.
Can I ask a question about that? Town shouldering upfront costs, although we don't own the property, so wasn't that more the state shouldering upfront costs? How are we shifting this to town burden?
If we're thinking about it in this way, we were imagining that the town would take over a portion of the site for a park, and that if it was a civic campus that included many of the many town functions, that the town would then be responsible for the site. So yes, the town would then need to
So any of
pay
these
to have access to the
high,
site.
any of the ones that say high, medium, you're assuming that the town is purchasing purchasing part of the parcel for these uses and the rest of it is staying with the state?
Not necessarily, it's, if we're thinking kind of order of magnitude, we're imagining that, because in that first scenario, that the town would be responsible for purchasing the site, that yes, the town would have a high upfront cost in the center one, because the town would have, there would be a smaller section of the site that is open space. Yes, the town would likely be responsible for either purchasing or upgrading or investing in that space, and also would have a different relationship to the site because of Junction Village. And then the last one, because that's low, it's, you know, it's largely turning that entire site over to a developer, maybe minus the wastewater treatment facility.
And just to be clear, the upfront costs are mostly in the demolition of the site. And John and the Landwise team shared that at the last meeting, that, you know, it's almost $100 million of demolition costs. And if you don't have a developer making that money back and absorbing that cost, then the town has to absorb some of that cost. So it's not so much about purchasing.
Only if the town acquires that portion of the property, though. I mean, in a way, it's not our problem if we're just zoning, right, as we keep talking about doing, then it wouldn't be our upfront costs.
Elizabeth, I think the purpose of this. Sorry, Kate, did you want? I was just going to say, I think the purpose of this scenario, and I can imagine it manifesting itself in several different ways. But I think the purpose of it having here is for us to think of it almost as a land banking model, where the town might take over some ownership of portions of the property or more. But it's one to put up there. I think it makes sense that the way to get it done might be this collection of uses. So
I think that's fine. I just think when you're looking at a slide like this, it's unclear and it seems like, oh, we're going to be taking all this money. Not necessarily. I mean, I just don't think, I know there's not a clean way to show that, but I think it needs to be prefaced or conditioned on the fact that this is if we take over some of the land for our own use.
Yeah, good point.
I think Elizabeth makes a good point, and I would add to it that yes, a developer might basically, if it really is going to cost $100 million to get this parcel back to zero for starting development, I mean that's a lot of money. It's on a smaller scale than 29 Main Street has been, which has been, I don't know how much they've had to pay to remediate that site, but it's almost like there's remediation required to get it back to the starting line.
Yeah, it's not $100 million. It's not $100 million. The $100 million was the total costs that we had for, including upgrades and everything. It's less than that to get it back to zero, but it's still significant. It might be order of magnitude of $30 million.
But that could be the state, or that could be the town if we take over a portion of ownership of some of it. But it's that 30 million, let's say, will not be covered by a developer. Is what you're saying in that scenario.
Exactly. Yeah.
But may not be covered by the town, John, to what you just said. Could be a state cost.
It could be the state. I mean, yeah.
Or a partner.
Also assume though that in the municipal use scenario, if this model couldn't at this point incorporate some kind of offsets that might come from future disposal of some other town property that was now able to be surplus because this was the new one or something. So, and by the way, the 2229 Main Street number is $300 million by the
I just want to check in with everybody. Are we going beyond 1:30? Are we okay with that? I'm directing that to the advisory board, I guess.
I guess stay an extra 15 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Me
mean,
too.
Okay. Well, thank you. And that, Rhiannon, that was not a comment on how quickly you're doing this. I think you're doing great.
Okay,
It's a lot to get through.
Patrick, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. I'm kind of processing the comments that have been made, and again, kind of going back to the criteria, not for the sake of making this slide perfect, but I think for the purposes of like, are we evaluating this in the right way? And so it feels like developer attractiveness and shouldering upfront costs to me feels like it's I think it's a good distinction. It feels like a level of distinction that is more specific than kind of the rest of the criteria. It feels to me like maybe something like development feasibility would kind of capture that essence. And I don't know how you do it with like one word or dollar signs, but I think that it actually needs a little bit description as to like what would have to be true in each of these three scenarios for them to come to pass. Because I think, in my mind, that's kind of the only way I can wrap my head around from a development feasibility perspective. We just discussed kind of three very different paths to get there.
Yep.
And so I think that maybe bringing that in here, I know that complicates a one-word framework, but could be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we felt like the purpose of today's conversation would be to kind of land on which of the three scenarios we do want to go about the deeper dive into. And so if you all feel okay with these three, then I think, Patrick, I do think that that's where we can do more of that, like the more explicit deeper dive into what is true for each of these. How do we explore the actual kind of mechanisms or means to make this happen, to make each of these happen? Because there are 50 million ways to make each of these happen, and we want to make sure that we are making good use of our time together over the next month to get there.
Totally.
all
I
I'm
think
saying.
I think what you're hearing from the room, though,
Yeah.
I agree, not to slow us down, but that there are obviously a lot of assumptions in any type of analysis like this. In this case, like the first two criteria that are being showed to the room are making like a huge assumption.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that even for the purpose of kind of public record as to like how we got to these three scenarios, I think we probably need to bring some more balance into this to say, either recognizing what the assumption is, that in this case, as currently outlaid, effectively there's two parties, the developer and the town, and either of those two parties are going to pay for these things.
Mhm.
Or that we kind of rejigger this a little bit to show that there are different assumptions that could be made to have the development paid for.
Yep. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I do think the latter scenario might be a helpful mechanism, since I think we might know a little bit more about some of the hows that we planned on.
Makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that clarification, Patrick. Appreciate it. Mark and then Scott.
I was just thinking though, that if the goal of where we're going right now is to try to create an environment where the community is expressing preference, there's the need to sort of illuminate the differences and sort of what these subjectively would kind of result in order to get us to a process where we're kind of in these next few community outreach meetings, especially the May 28th session, giving people some semblance of what the choice is before them.
Right.
Is probably more important than diving. In other words, I'm sort of advocating for some level of equal development of them so that they can be compared.
Yeah. think that makes sense. I believe that's how we're imagining that we would go about the workshops themselves. Essentially, we're giving people a more abstracted version of the site and the ability to fill in 12 boxes with the different land uses based on these same land uses that you see here. And in that exercise, we would share these three scenarios, but then also articulate the range of scenarios and ask people to help weigh in and explore what they imagine the site could support. And so I think, Mark, to your point, it's both a chance for people to start to understand, how do we get to where we got to with these scenarios, but then also a chance for them to either, confirm or to argue against and express support or advocacy for a scenario that we decided not to consider. Scott, you were next.
Oh, thanks, Ryan. Quick question about developer attractiveness. If someone's looking at this from the community and sees the attractiveness, they might say they think it's a pretty site. When I think of developer attractiveness, I think of it's really the return on investment and does it work? So it'd be like, does the ROI work? The attractive, that's really what it's, in essence, that's what a developer's looking at, whether it's, does it work for them?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we can definitely edit that language. We had thought about the idea of having something similar to return on investment, but know that return on investment means different things to different entities that are engaged in
whatever
this.
it's IR, whatever the terminology works.
Yeah.
Something that
Yeah.
speaks to a developer's mindset. And the
Yeah.
other thing I had was on the thriving mixed use neighborhood scenario, the implementation timeframe, you said short. I'm just curious, what's your thought process on that? Why that's short versus the revenue focused vibrant campus with all the retail?
I think the commercial that you're seeing in the purple is not just retail, but a combination of commercial uses. And I think, everything we've heard from the folks we talked to in the commercial real estate industry is that, residential is so in demand, and commercial, given the state of the office market and the type of industrial that, is commonly seen around here, would be slower to take shape. And I think without a lot of residential to support new retail, we're thinking about those things in tandem, and we just think that would be a longer time horizon.
Thank you.
Dan, do you mind if I make a comment? Megan, here.
Sure.
Hey, sorry, it's awkward being in the room without a virtual hand to raise, but I think I just want to kind of say one thing after Mark's comments. One thing that's striking me after kind of sitting with these three scenarios for a second is kind of the blue use, the mission leaning, right? I am a little worried about having that one use associated with the and only with the one scenario out of these three that is not going to bring any revenues, or lower on the revenue side. And I wonder, I think there could be obviously so many different scenarios, but that could be subbed into another one that is, you could put it in the middle and swap out the green with the blue in the middle. I feel like there's a way to, it's not, I don't want to take away, and maybe that's just the way I'm thinking about it, is to say, well, the only way to make a civic campus or some element of the site to be a civic campus would be a challenge on the revenue side. Because I think there is a way to fold it into at least a revenue neutral that I think should have kind of a fighting chance at a review.
Just to sort of add on to that, so when we subtracted out the 12 acres that were in the riverfront, did we also subtract out the area for the wastewater treatment facility in that? Because I think that's crucial for the entire development process. And are we talking about, that absent in these scenarios?
Yeah, Mark, we assumed that the wastewater treatment facility is already captured separately. It's not part of the 54 acres of development site because we considered it to be its own its own entity, that it has its own trajectory, but does contribute to the future of the site. Yeah.
To Megan's point, and I suppose agency and their team should be responding, but just
Yeah.
what it's worth, my take on it is none of these things are mutually exclusive. It's just a way to start talking about it and thinking about it. And if what we hear from the public is they want a blend of, they want some blue in the middle or the other scenario, I think that's can be fine. But for purposes of trying to grapple with it today and at this pass, it kind of is a way to organize it. That's just my take on it.
Yeah, Dan, the way that we talked about it, I think last week was, how do we start to land on a heuristic model for some of this? And so, to us, this is enabling us to explore, each one that leans into a different land use. So it's none of them are all about housing. And so this helps us to understand, what does it mean to include some civic uses? What does it mean to lean into more commercial uses, and what does it mean to lean into more housing? And then I think, Megan, to your point, we don't see this as an exercise that at the end of the day we choose scenario B, that there will end up being some kind of ultimately a hybrid approach, but that, to be able to hand something like this over to whomever is taking on the future of the site, to have, all of those different models at their fingertips to help us make those decisions together with that entity, will give you all at least the kind of the best range of options.
I guess the difference is that there's green and purple and yellow in all of them, but there's only blue in one. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
so it does.
That's true.
It's like, how do we split these colors? And so it just feels like it's being treated differently.
Again, it's only within that 54 acres, Megan. I'm sorry, we should have clarified that, or we can clarify that more to the community as well. But these boxes are only meant to be the 54 acres, and the wastewater treatment plant and some of the additional land around that is outside of that development zone.
Can I offer a suggestion along the lines of some other comments that were made earlier on to sort of refine the slides? But I wonder if just, you get one chance to make a first impression, right? And so I think a lot of people are going to jump at these things. And so maybe it's just a matter of queuing them up. And I don't have the solution to this, but just queuing up when people are looking at it so they understand that stuff could move around.
Yeah. Yeah.
So one follow-up comment. First of all, I just want to note, this is one of the best discussions we've had with this full group. This is value added, kind of thinking about the process and the possibilities. So thank you, guys. I'm a very ambitious person, but I don't want to suggest that I'm not optimistic we can't come up with a kind of full support for one scenario or another in the next 30 days or whatever, right? It's going to be hard. I guess I've got maybe a naive zoning question. We've identified the different potential uses. If we don't come up with the perfect mix or the assignment of uses for particular portions of the site by June 30th, could we not go ahead and get the site rezoned for these types of uses more generally without limiting or specifying how much would be on the site as a whole?
I think that is our impression. Of course, you'll see on our next steps slide later on in this deck, we really want to have a deeper conversation with the land use subcommittee. But we do imagine that there are opportunities for us to be able to think about zoning without having to land on a specific scenario. In fact, I think that the communication in the RFP, the scope in the RFP was that we would June 30th, the end to June 30th was essentially the three scenarios and a communication of the trade-offs of each of the three scenarios, not one scenario. Yeah.
Thanks.
But
Can I interrupt
Dan.
for a second? Just want to check in again, doing my chair responsibilities. So we're basically 15 minutes away from losing some people or maybe wrapping up the meeting.
Yep.
If we divide that into, maybe we don't even need to divide it into three, but if we divide it into three, it's 5 minutes apiece, 5 minutes for you guys, agency, to sort of wrap up, 5 minutes for, and this is a question to the advisory board, are there comments that, or updates that the various subcommittees need to do, or can we give that time to agency?
I can speak for legal. You can give that time. I don't
Okay.
have anything.
Okay, and John, I know you're like,
I'd like 1 minute.
okay, good. Then they get four. And then public comment, I'll try to hold out 5 minutes worth. So thank you guys. Sorry for the interruption.
Great. We'll go ahead and start moving it forward. So Kate, you want to talk about the three scenarios more concretely?
Yeah, sure thing. So what we've tried to do is just start to mass on site what these three scenarios could look like. And I want to kind of give two caveats. These are not designs, they're just quick massing. And the site could be massed a lot of different ways with these same types of programming. So what we're trying to do here is to show what the key priorities of the scenarios would be and how much of different types of housing and other uses you might see as part of this scenario. So this first one, the civic and institutional campus, you can see that in all scenarios, we've reserved the DOC agricultural land and the cemetery. The unique piece of this one is that it's really leaning into creating an interpretive trail that memorializes some of the key moments of prison history, inclusive of the cemetery, the Malcolm X block, and aspects of the wall and the tower. These are all pieces that we heard from the community would be valuable to interpret and to bring forward and kind of the collective understanding of what the site has been over time. There could also be a museum as part of the warden's house and something happening with the chapel. This scheme reuses three of the buildings on site, the foundries, the community center, and the industries building to be both a community center and some sort of vocational technical school. Again, that anchor and kind of what it actually is could vary depending on the institutional partner that is found for this. But we think that there's some good space for a vocational technical school to occupy this space. And then the community center, a town use that we've heard a lot of energy around from the community conversations, could again anchor the site in companionship with playing fields and courts that we've heard are desired and needed in the town. And then finally, the Junction Village site would be the focus of that affordable housing to sort of align with that mission leaning idea around the site. On the next one, yeah, go ahead.
Can I comment on a couple of things on this site?
Sure.
One is I think that we have a very strong vocational technical school that Concord uses, Minuteman, and I think if I think people are going to say we don't need a VOTEC school, and why would we build one? So I have some concerns there. Secondly, talking about charter schools, the same thing. I mean, I feel like you're hitting a few buttons that the community will not find resonance with, and that could make this somewhat less appealing in terms of its real civic value. And then also, it seems confusing to me that the two plans that have reuse of existing buildings I don't see where we're getting any kind of economic benefit from that. And so I'm just wondering, why are they less attractive economically when there's, substantial reuse going on? So that's just some questions I have about this example.
I'm going to encourage you not to answer that right now, just because of time.
No,
If that's okay, Linda.
So you're thinking, that's fine.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. Great comments. Appreciate it. The Vibrant Center for Commerce, again, there's lots of ways we could mass this on site, but I think the team sees real value in creating sort of an innovation campus with a green quad at its core. Again, two buildings are reused as part of this, and there's a stepping up of density potentially as you get closer towards Route 2 and Commonwealth Avenue. There are a multifamily neighborhood tucked into the west side of Commonwealth Avenue, as well as housing tucked in at Junction Village. But lots of different potential uses of that purple space. Here we're labeling it Innovation Campus, but it could also host science technology, health and lifestyle. A portion of it could be a hotel or other uses. There's, as Ree said, a real potential of an institutional partnership or anchor that would strengthen the scheme. But the goal is that it be like a walkable kind of live work style campus with a smaller interpretive portion. And then finally, a thriving mixed-use neighborhood. This is approaching the density that we had you all play with in terms of the Lego activity on May 5th. So you are quite familiar with how kind of much density of housing is needed and density of commercial space is needed in order to reach that 750 units goal. And so what we've done here is show a scheme that would really arrange some of that kind of commercial use along a spine just off of Route 2. This idea came from the great work that you all did with Legos, but the idea that there's a separate sort of road that's back of the warden's house that provides that spine of commercial activity, which could be really activated. And then a conversation between the warden's house and the new community center with the provision of some public amenities, fields, event space, courts that could coincide with that community center space. You can see that there is a variety of different types of housing massed here. So lower density housing along Commonwealth Avenue to align with the current use there. Some higher densities as you get deeper into the site, especially adjacent to the wastewater treatment plant where there's the highest density of housing, as well as parking deck beneath to help buffer the two uses there, wastewater treatment and housing. So I know we wanted to leave you with just a few ideas, just one more moment, Dan. I think our hope today was to confirm the suggested scenarios, know that these are early. So we would be advancing these sketches and draft massings to help the community visualize what these scenarios could look like, as well as advancing the financial metrics and model based on the feedback that you've provided today, and continue to refine and storytell those for a community activity on the 28th and 29th. Thanks, Dan.
Great, thank you, Kate and Rhiannon. All right, John, how about a minute for you, and then we'll go into public comment?
Can I share my screen for 2 seconds?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I just wanted to quickly review the stakeholder list because there are several stakeholders that were actually named in the legislation as requiring consultation. And so you see here in column C, the yellow and green, where it says named in the legislation. These are the different organizations, and I just want to be sure that the Legal and Government Affairs Committee is in touch with these folks, because I suppose this should probably happen before June 30th, but no time right now to report whether you have been already, but I just wanted to put this back on the radar as we need to be sure that we have formally consulted with these organizations. The two that I know we have are the Select Board of Concord, Concord Business Partnership, and maybe ULI because we've had conversation with them, but let's just be sure that we don't forget that we are required by law to consult with them.
Todd, I'll confirm that we've said something to all of them.
Okay. That's it.
Yeah, just to be clear though, the legislation required DCAM to do that.
Okay. Okay, then good.
I think we've said something anyway, but I'll confirm.
We are also communicating with them. Yes.
All right. Thank you.
I would open it up for, thank you, John. I would open it up for public comment. Does anybody see it? I do not see anybody with a hand up. All right. Well, as John pointed out, that was excellent. And thank you very much for that presentation for everybody. That was great progress. And if there are not any other issues, I would entertain a motion for.
Remember the schedule for just a moment and
Sure.
ask a question. So when will we see the next iteration of these as a board?
So we have our next conversation, I believe, on June 2nd. And that's when we would plan to bring the next iteration to this group. We are preparing for the public workshops over the next week, and so that will be where most of our energy is focused. And so I do wonder, Dan and Patrick, if there's a good way for us to solicit any feedback from this group, in addition to the feedback we've already had, to ensure that we do you feel good about the scenarios and can start to move them forward or can challenge any of the scenarios between now and next week?
So we have a, if I'm correct, Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we have a land use meeting schedule for tomorrow afternoon.
Yes,
And
and the subject will be to sort of look at the metrics that were presented and help and try and come up with some ways to help refine those. And
Great.
And the other thing is, I just want to thank Elizabeth Hughes for the timely article on incentive zoning and suggest people take a look at it, because zoning is sort of a blunt tool, and if we can create incentives for to defray some of the public cost and put it on the developer in terms of maybe another story of height, so the town doesn't have to pay for it, things like that, that sort of just we unleash our imaginations to get to the results that we want, would be great. So thank you, Elizabeth, for that. And the other tool that we haven't discussed is development agreements. Maybe we could work with DCAM in terms of how we sell, how they sell the property, and maybe there's an agreement. So if it goes to a institutional use, which is a nonprofit, doesn't get transferred to them until they agree to a payment in lieu of taxes agreement, things like that, that make it more palatable for the community to move forward and realize that, you know, we're trying to protect the community's interests as we develop this plan that will be part of the Concord's future. So,
and I just want to come back to Rhiannon's request. So what I would suggest, if it's possible, is maybe within the subcommittees, I'm not sure what your schedule is for meeting, but somehow within that construct that you guys sort of collect your comments, perhaps both from a full AB perspective as well as a subcommittee perspective, and roll those up to the land use so that we can get all that information to the agency team, you know, sometime over. There's not a lot of time between now and the second.
I think that could also work, but I was gonna say that if individual members have questions or want to make a comment, maybe they could just reply directly back to Justina's email where she sent out the draft of this. And that would go through the agency. As long as you don't reply all, it's a communication with the consultants themselves, and that might be an efficient way to get individual comments on the material we reviewed today into
That's
their
great.
process.
Yep, great idea, Mark. Thank you.
And we'll
and
send
you,
out the updated slides as well, so you can reply to that one.
Okay. Yeah.
all right. Well, not the perfect timing. It's 1:45, so I would entertain a motion from anyone that would like to propose that to adjourn the meeting.
So moved.
All right. Thank you all.